Hello and welcome to DevOps Deployment Failures and Fixes, where I am covering top deployment failure Q&A you need to know to confidently crack your interviews. With this course, you'll never skip a question in your interview on deployment failure. So let's get started and make sure you're fully prepared for the interview.
Starting with our first question. A deployment fails due to insufficient permission or access rights. How would you troubleshoot and rectify this deployment failure related to permissions? Here's how you can answer. I would start by checking the deployment logs to see exactly what's being blocked. Then, I would review the user roles and RBAC settings in Kubernetes to make sure right permissions are in place. If needed, I would work with the infra or security team to fix the access and try the deployment again. Moving on with our next question. The deployment process encounters errors related to secrets or sensitive configuration data. How would you handle this deployment failure and ensure secure handling of secrets? Here's how you can answer. I would start by reviewing the deployment configuration to check how sensitive data like password, API keys, or tokens are being handled. I would make sure they are stored securely using Kubernetes secrets or tools like Vault. If any secrets are misconfigured or missing, I would update the deployment manifest to reference the correct ones and reapply the deployment. Moving on with our next question. The deployment fails due to network connectivity issues between application components. How would you diagnose and resolve this deployment failure related to network connectivity? Here's how you can answer. I would first check the network settings in the cluster to make sure the application components are allowed to talk to each other. Then I would use tools like kubectl, execute, and ping to test if the pods can connect. If there's still an issue, I would check for any firewall rules or network policies that might be blocking the traffic. Moving on with our next question. The deployment process fails due to insufficient disk space or storage capacity. How would you address this deployment failure caused by disk space constraints? Here's how you can answer. First, I would check the disk usage using commands like df-h or inside a pod using kubectl execute pod name --df-h. Then, I would look for larger logs or temporary files and clean them up with something like kubectl execute pod name --rm-rf file or the folder name. If space is still not enough, I would scale up the storage by increasing the size of persistent volume or create a new one depending on the setup. Moving on with our next question. The deployment fails due to compatibility issues between application components and external dependencies. How would you handle this deployment failure caused by compatibility issues? Here's how you can answer. I would review the application's dependencies and external integration to identify any version mismatches or compatibility constraint. If necessary, I would update the application code or configuration to ensure compatibility with the required dependencies. Additionally, I would establish version pinning or dependency management practices to prevent future compatibility issues during deployment. Moving on with our next question. The deployment process encounters errors related to DNS resolution or domain name configuration. How would you troubleshoot and resolve this deployment failure associated with DNS issues? Here's how you can respond. First, I would confirm it's a DNS issue by using nslookup inside the pod. Then I would check etcresolve.conf file and inspect core DNS logs to ensure it's running properly. I would also verify the domain resolves externally and check for blocked port 53 in network policies or firewalls. If it's misconfigured domain or DNS setup, I would fix it in the configs or cloud VPC settings. For quick resolution, I may temporarily use a fallback DNS like 8.8.8.8. Moving on with our next question. The deployment fails due to conflicts or inconsistencies in the environment variables or configuration settings. How would you address this deployment failure related to configuration inconsistencies? Here's how you can answer. I would check the deployment config and environment variables to find any mistakes or conflicts. If something's wrong, I would fix the configuration file or update the variable values. Before redeploying, I would double check the changes either manually or with config tools to make sure everything looks good. Moving on with our next question. The deployment process fails due to timeouts or connectivity issues with external services or APIs. How would you troubleshoot and rectify this deployment failure related to external dependencies? Here's how you can answer. I would check if the cluster can reach the external services by testing network routes and firewall rules. kubectl execute pod name --ping externalservice.com. If those services are down or unreachable, I would inform the right teams and suggest adding retries or fallback options in the application. I would also keep an eye on their status and performance to catch issues early in the future. Moving on to the next, here's one with the certificate issues. The deployment fails due to misconfigured or invalid SSL certificate for HTTPS communications. And the interviewer asks you, how would you handle this deployment failure associated with SSL certificate issues? Here's how you can answer it. I would check the SSL certificate is valid and matches the app's domain with the OpenSSL command. If it's expired or misconfigured, I would replace it with a valid one from the trusted CA. Then I would make sure the ingress controller is set up correctly for HTTPS and SSL termination. Maybe I can use a command kubectl describe ingress name. Moving on with our next question. After deploying a microservices app, authentication service and user profile service both crash due to unexpected port conflicts. How would you troubleshoot and resolve this deployment issue? Here's how you can respond. I would check the service configs to see if both are trying to use the same port. This can happen if the containers use shared configuration files or values with the same default port. I would review the deployment YAML or Helm chart to make sure each service has a unique container port and target port. To fix this, I would assign different ports to each service, make sure they run in separate pods, and update the configuration before redeploying. That is it for today. See you in the next one.